Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Has the war in Ukraine accelerated the emergence of the so-called Global South? And could these developing nations change the future of the global order? With me to discuss this are Wen-ti Sung, National Chengchi University Department of Political Science Professor, Wen-ti Sung, a non-resident fellow at Washington-based Atlantic Council, and Marcin Jerzewski, the Taiwan office head of think tank the European Values Center for Security Policy. A warm welcome to the show today. South Africa is considering its options over an international criminal court arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. The Russian president has been invited to a BRICS summit in August in South Africa, hosting the leaders of Brazil, India, China and South Africa. However, as an ICC member, South Africa would be required to arrest Putin under the warrant issued in March for his alleged crimes in Ukraine. The footage here is of Ukrainians living in South Africa protesting the visit by Russia's foreign minister in January. Wen-ti Sung, let me come to you first. Can you think of any country in the north that would try to get around this arrest warrant? Obviously here we have South Africa thinking of ways to get around arresting Putin when he comes to the BRICS summit.
It's just unlikely that Putin will ever travel to those countries we'll perceive as in the global north or the Western country in general anyway. So in that sense, it's the kind of position that you are able to take to signal your commitment to values and international norms without truly having to pay a direct and significant political cost. So it's hard to imagine that any country in the global north broadly defined will be publicly coming out against this at this juncture.
Marcin, how has the Ukraine war, how has it accelerated the emergence or the assertiveness of the global south?
Countries in the global south generally feel that the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine is diverting resources that could go towards bolstering development of global south countries away from them. That's why there is quite a lot of pressure on countries in the global north and, for instance, members of the G7 to really show gestures of goodwill and sustained commitment to facilitating sustainable economic development and bolstering human security in the global south and not only in Ukraine.
Yes, exactly. And Marcin, how about this term, the global south, and can we compare it with maybe the non-aligned movement during the Cold War?
The term global south has initially emerged in late 60s, so it is not exactly a new concept, it is not a new invention. However, we can see some parallels between the more institutionalized idea of a non-aligned movement and the global south. The global south can be understood as a general rubric for underdeveloped and socioeconomically deprived parts of the world, but also to some extent it can refer to this quadricontinental, so what I mean by that is Latin America, Africa, Asia and Oceania, this quadrilateral space with platforms and cooperation practices beyond these dominated by former colonial powers. So non-aligned movement would then be a part of the global south.
Professor Su, Marcin mentioned there sort of like the post-colonialism. So the non-aligned movement we know emerged post-World War II and post its colonialism. What are the other roots of the global south in your view?
Well, in current time, I think the other very important route for global south is the transformation of globalization. Especially after 9/11, the 9/11 event. The whole the world order has been changed a lot, and during that time, because of the United States and also many Western countries would like to initiate the anti-terrorism war. So basically, they also need the cooperation from the global south. So I think that is one of the roots for the reemergence of global south.
Okay. Wen-ti, how about you? What else kind of brings together the members of the Global South in terms of their stance, maybe towards the West?
I think for a lot of countries in the Global South, there's probably a somewhat sense of a historical or structural injustice that they feel like obviously there's a legacy of imperialism and colonialism in the past, which that makes them feel like it may contribute to their continued relative underdevelopment today. And that is why also they may not feel as much of a direct stake in terms of fight that they see as happening between global North countries, or for example, in this instance, the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, for example. So that contributes to a sense of alienation for sure, but also I think on a more strategic level, it gives them both more momentum and reason for taking a more standoffish stance when it comes to making value-based positions such as the war on Ukraine, such as voting at the UN General Assembly to condemn or criticize Russia, for example, over the war.
Then let's talk about, Professor Su, what Lula da Silva has said about Ukraine. They're quite controversial comments. What is his position on Ukraine?
Well, as a member state of the BRICS, Brazil is not particularly critical to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In April this year, Brazil started to push to end the war by proposing that it can serve as a mediator. And however, the possible solution that Lula proposed was very controversial. He has proposed that Ukraine cede the Crimean Peninsula to Russia in order to put an end to the war. But overall, Brazil's stance in relation to the Ukraine war can be summarized in 3 points. First, Ukraine should, Brazil argued that Ukraine should be blamed as much as Russia. Second, Brazil criticized that the United States should stop encouraging the war in Ukraine. And third, Brazil argues that Ukraine must make some compromise with Russia to a certain extent in order to end the war.
Okay, let's play a clip of the White House press secretary responding to the comments that Professor Su just mentioned by the Brazilian president in March. Let's take a look.
Suggesting that the United States and Europe are not interested in peace, or that we share responsibility for the war, we believe, and it is true, that it is plainly wrong. Of course we want this war to end. Of course we do.
Marcin, so that doesn't sound too neutral to me. What's your view?
There is something that brings countries of the Global South together is the willingness to benefit from having powerful actors without having to choose a side. And I think that the stance put forward by Lula is clearly demonstrating how this sentiment plays out in practice. So Brazil, and especially under this current left-wing government, is trying to stay away from signals that would make Brazil appear as aligning itself with the United States and the countries of the West.
Do you think perhaps they've gone a little bit too far? I mean, he did pull back comments though when he went to Europe.
I believe that it might be perceived as a national interest of Brazil to really advocate for a stance which is that of a compromise. So I think that in the perception of publics in the Global South, Ukraine is also expected to make certain sacrifices before resolution of the conflict.
Okay, and Wen-ti, finally, so do you believe that Brazil's position, which has shifted a little bit, that is representative of the Global South as a whole, or is the Global South, more divided, is not a homogeneous group of countries with similar stance?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it would be a gross stereotyping to say the entire Global South take one position, given the great diversity and continental distance between so many countries in the Global South. But I think Marcin, that definitely agree one thing he said, and that is for a lot of countries in Global South, there's a feeling that whatever goes on between Russia and Ukraine, it's not really their fight. They don't have a direct stake in it. And there's a lot of time, if you picture Global South's friendship in diplomacy as a market, for them, it always benefits them, always give them more bargaining power if they can have more than one buyer for their friendship. So in that sense, they are not necessarily happy per se, but it may be advantageous to them to have more than one buyer, more than one great power who is currently carrying their friendship at the moment. And that's why you do tend to see utterances from Brazil, for example, that tend to signal that somewhat of a whataboutism position, somewhat of a both sides to blame position. That's a way to signal that we are not directly tied to any one side unconditionally, because if they do, that's going to decrease their bargaining power.
I mean, you mentioned that they don't have a stake per se in say the Ukraine war, but you know they have been impacted quite severely. You know, the export of inflation, food prices going up. Is that not enough of a stake?
Yes, that's a stake for sure. But what I say is sometimes the cost of the war, in that sense, is relatively socialized. So many countries, so many economies around the world suffering the economic consequences of inflation. But maybe some countries are better in a position to better benefit from that as well. For example, maybe that will lead to fluctuation in the market for need for primary resources, for natural resources, of which the Global South may be in a position to provide both as an alternative supplier or perhaps as an alternative market as well.
Professor Su?
Yeah.
Would you like to comment?
Yeah. Well, I think a better way to describe Brazil's stance on the war is that it tried to propose a sort of new idea that is different from that of most European countries and the United States in the name of neutrality. But I'm not sure whether it is correct to say that Brazil's stance is identical to Russia's stance, because if both countries' stances are identical, Brazil should have asked Ukraine to surrender immediately, or Russia would have agreed with Brazil's proposal that Ukraine's cession to the Crimean Peninsula will be a sufficient condition to end the war, but apparently it's not the case. There have been 6 UN General Assembly votes on this war, and among these 6 votes, Brazil sided with the United States for 4. So basically, that signals that Brazil's stances is not totally identical with Russia's stance. But all in all, the main differences in Brazil's stance and the United States stance on this war is that Brazil argues that it is very important for Ukraine to make some concessions to end the war, while the U.S. and most of the Western countries argues that it is not necessary to make any concessions.
Okay, very interesting. We'll carry on this. Following Lula's comments on Ukraine, he drew praise from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
В том, что касается процессов на Украине, мы признательны бразильским друзьям за.
Months earlier, in April, Lula was invited to Beijing and enjoyed a lavish state visit. He discussed the war in Ukraine with Xi Jinping before returning home to make his controversial comments about the West. And as a sign of how the Global South is being courted by the world's richest countries, $600 billion was pledged to developing countries in infrastructure programs at the recent G7 summit. Let's take a look.
We want eyes-level partnership with the partner countries. We want to find solutions to the real challenges low- and middle-income countries are facing today.
Together, we've initiated quality and sustainable infrastructure projects across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And we're strengthening our shared climate security, health security, and food security, and economic security. All 4 are critical.
Professor Su, so the US says that Lula is simply parroting Chinese or Russian propaganda. Now, from your previous answer, you don't believe that is the case. Is that true? Can you talk us through what is Brazil's relationship with Russia?
Yeah, Brazil stated that it suffered a lot from the consequences of the war, mainly because the isolation and the sanction imposed on Russia caused the increase in energy and fertilizers. And
obviously Brazil is a huge importer of fertilizers for its agribusiness.
Brazil has been highly dependent on the fertilizers imported from Russia. So in that sense, Brazil's relations with Russia is very important to both countries.
And I understand that actually it stretches back quite far. Basically, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia became an important partner for Brazil. So was that the trading relationship that started then, or did it expand into different areas?
Well, in Latin America, there are, of course, mainly one very important actor, which is the United States. So many Latin American countries try very hard to, seek a new way to sort of counterbalance the influence from the United States. And that has happened for a long time, maybe for decades. And so Brazil, the largest country in Latin America, is very eager to seek like different sources for enhancing its own national interests, right? So that is why Brazil tried very hard to build a good relationship with Russia and China, and not just with the United States.
Marcin, let's move to a different part of the Global South, the Arab states. How do they fit into the Global South framework?
Firstly, we also have to emphasize that the Arab world is not a homogeneous region, and we have to be very careful not to overgeneralize. But one thing that holds true for majority of players in the Arab world is that those countries also sought to strike a balance between the two warring parties. Even though most of the Arab League members have called for a diplomatic settlement, essentially none of them were trying to impose tools of economic statecraft, so for example economic sanctions on Russia, or make moves that might appear as a form of antagonizing Moscow. However, what is quite important to bear in mind is that the Arab League, so a regional organization, has made attempts to play a part in moving the momentum of the war closer towards this diplomatic settlement, which I mentioned. So yes, Zelensky traveled to Jeddah, to the summit of the Arab League, before traveling to Japan to attend G7, and he used some very interesting language, which definitely corresponds to the concepts which are important in the Global South. He spoke of fighting opposition and
there was a shift, wasn't there? So usually the rhetoric to the West is, upholding democracy, defending democracy, whereas I understand that it shifted to this concept of imperialism.
Precisely. So Zelensky spoke of fighting occupation and repelling colonizers with justice. And especially considering the situation between Israel and Palestine, which to the discontent of members of the Arab League, Zelensky didn't address explicitly in Jeddah. These concepts are very important in the regional psyche of policymakers.
Wen-ti, I mean, how successful do you think Zelensky may be in terms of, that narrative? How appealing can that be to Arab states?
To Arab states, I think it remains to be seen. This is going to be a long project, I think, to really shape how these countries perceive their own national interest on something that's almost structural in a sense. But Zelensky, I think, has been, however, relatively successful in terms of convincing a greater share of Western countries to step up to support Ukraine. We do see that, for example, in pledging of new additional military and other assistance from Western countries to Ukraine right after G7 addressed by Zelensky. But I think one other factor that is important to bear in mind here is that how Zelensky has been trying to, I think, make a conscious outreach to Western left or center voters, in a sense, because for a long time, Western voters, left or center Western voters, tend to have this sense of justice, if you will. They feel like obviously there's a legacy of imperialism, colonialism. They feel like they need to be anti-imperialism in their outlook, which is in a sense a noble cause. But a lot of the time, that anti-imperialism sentiment can translate into, especially in the post-Cold War era, almost like anti-Americanism, because for them, America was for quite a while, for a couple of decades, the only power with sufficient ability to act almost imperialistically, in a sense. So that creates a problem, however, when you have more than one country that maybe pursue actions or policies or even aggression that could be construed as, if not imperialistic, then definitely in violation of international norm, e.g. the war on Ukraine, for example. And yet, for a lot of opinion leaders in the West, especially those on left or center side of the spectrum, tend to continue to blame the responsibility of the Ukraine war on not so much Russia, but on America, or at least think they are both to blame in that sense. So I think Zelensky is stepping out here to really drive home to the message that, hey, there may be more than one quote-unquote imperialistic-like country in the world, and perhaps sometimes it's important for left or center voters in the West to be a bit more impartial and not be completely stuck in this instinctive anti-American mindset.
Fascinating there. So we're getting onto the multipolarity theme, of course, but yeah, there could be imperialistic US and imperialistic Russia, and also in this neck of the woods, imperialistic China. Professor Su, how do we see the West responding to, let's dial back a bit. So we saw there in the clips, the praise coming from Sergei Lavrov, obviously very pleased that Brazil's Lula, seemed to be equating equal blame to both Russia and Ukraine there. So is it fair to say that countries like Russia and China, that they have been attempting to influence the global South in order to bring them to their side of the divide?
Yeah, clearly, I think that is the case. Especially if you look at the UN organs and these sub-organizations within the UN. China has played an increasing role in sort of controlling the secretariat of these organizations, and the effect is pretty obvious. Like in so many votes within these organizations, China has been pretty successful in securing that the votes of these members are in favor of China, and the United States clearly see that. So basically, after Biden came into power, I think that one of the U.S. policy in international organizations is trying to get back the influence of the United States in order to sort of counterbalance the influence from China. Yeah, so basically, yeah, clearly it's true that Russia and China have been trying very hard to get more control in international organization and community.
Marcin, how is the West responding to those kinds of moves? I understand there was the first summit in February of the I2U2, which is India, Israel, United States and the UAE.
I think it is definitely important that conversations happen in formats that are more inclusive of different countries, also countries characterized by different level of development and socioeconomic standing, also countries with different historical trajectories, which understand the importance of sovereignty, given that they acquired their own sovereignty not so long ago. However, other than summits and conversations, I think that something that we really need to evaluate is the material impact of such frameworks and whether they will be able to bring the necessary hardware that many countries in the global south fear is not sufficiently provided for, given the outflow of resources to Ukraine.
Wen-ti, there's another grouping which we're a lot more familiar with, the Quad. Now, India is a member of both the I2, U2, as well as the Quad. You know, tell me about, you know, the what this offers to Quad to have India in it.
I think for the Quad to have India in it, I think that obviously provides, first of all, if we perceive Quad to be it's very hard to put this politely, but if we perceive Quad to be a preventive device to ensure that China's rights can be managed relatively smoothly and stably, and that its impact on regional order will ultimately prove to be a benign one in the long term, then you do need those ballasts in the meantime to ensure that China's sense of adventurism could be tamed. So in that sense, obviously you have US, the number one superpower, you have Japan, Australia, both are largely maritime powers. So to really complete the puzzle, you want to also, however, have a continental power of sufficient size that preferably has a shared border with China to have a very straightforward, direct stake in that process. And that country happens to be India. And that's why I think India, in that sense, provides both the continental ability as well as that direct military direct stake in terms of shared border with China. And that's why India, I think, is, despite all the complaints you may hear from American defense policy planners about how the Quad may not be proceeding as fast as they want it to be, India remains an indispensable member of the Quad and the whole regional order building process.
Okay. Now, part of the Global South stretches to the Pacific Islands, a region that has been called Australia's backyard, to the dismay of people in those countries. My next guest is Cleo Paskal, a senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, speaking to me from Washington, D.C. Let's take a look. Cleo, we're hearing a lot about the Global South. You know, this is not a new term. You know, we've had the Global North as well as the Global South, but there seems to be a re-emergence of this term. Why do you think that is?
Countries that are not the West and don't want to fall into Chinese orbit are trying to figure out a way of defining who they are in terms of their economies and their societies, which don't fit neatly into either structure, either this authoritarianism that we're seeing coming out of Beijing, or whatever's coming out of Washington at the moment. So there's a kind of clustering together. It looks a little bit like what the non-aligned movement was during the previous Cold War, but it's very different. It's more of a realignment.
Realignment? What do you mean by that?
So the non-alignment movement was really not wanting to, they were saying they didn't want to fall into either camp. But in this case, many of the leaders, including India, for example, are very clear that they have a lot of problems with China in particular. China killed 20 of its soldiers in June 2020. It's banned TikTok and WeChat. Its approach is very different, but in the same way, it also is concerned about the way the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan and some of the other policies that have been coming out of the West. So it doesn't view them as equidistant, if I can put it that way, which non-aligned pretended it did.
You're North American Canadian, so you know. Do you perhaps have any bias? So what I understand is that the Global South, some voices in this Global South, they dislike what they call the hypocrisy of the West and also of the US in terms of its attitudes, its sort of moral superiority.
A country is not just its government. There's obviously its government, but even within its government, there are different branches of the government. So if you're looking from India's perspective, you might definitely get some preaching that you don't like coming out of the State Department, but you'll also be getting some support that you do like coming out of the Department of Defense, especially in securing your northern border. It's been published that the U.S. has helped with satellite imagery for India to be able to defend itself against some of the Chinese aggression. But even more than that, the people-to-people connections are very strong, and the belief in many of the same common values like democracy, rule of law, that sort of thing, ties them in a way that they certainly aren't tied to China. So if you look at how Indo-Americans are large, vibrant, integrated part of the U.S., including Vice President of the United States. That's not something that's going to be happening anytime soon in China, and that gives an indication of the comfort level between those two societies.
Let's talk about some of the triggers. Ukraine.
That's had an enormous impact, and you saw it when the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands brought it up elliptically at the meeting with the Pacific Island leaders when Prime Minister Modi was there on May 22nd. And he talked in the context of Ukraine exporting inflation to his country. It wasn't, these are countries that have been through a very tough time. They've been through COVID, they've been through other secondary sanction shocks, things like that. And so their economies are being buffeted by things well beyond their control. And in some cases, it can seem like the decisions coming out of the West are being made without regard for their large populations that are living in quite marginal economic circumstances. And so that's something else that's kind of bringing them together. But again, it isn't necessarily pushing them towards China, but it's creating a situation where, for example, I was at a conference in India recently where they were saying that 18 countries have come together to try to create, to do more trade outside of the US dollar system, in part because of concerns over sanctions that can come out of the US at any time.
So what currency are they switching to?
They're doing a lot of currency swaps among themselves, between themselves. So creating this really is kind of a third way, which again is what the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands talked about when Prime Minister Modi was there. They're not abandoning at all any of the principles that that the West would normally try to identify with itself: democracy, human rights, accountability, transparency, rule of law. There's that old saying that when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, and I think they see themselves as the grass, and they're looking for kind of an elephant that can just stand there and provide some shelter while they try to grow and prosper in a very contested environment.
Do you think there are any lessons that the West should be taking on board in terms of how they treat developing countries?
You need to listen and pay attention, and that's why those on the ground in those countries want more people-to-people connections. They want to be better understood. They want just things like the Peace Corps, things like that. And when you look at what India has talked about in its 12-point plan to bring out across the Pacific Islands, it's things that if you truly understand the Pacific Islands, you understand how important it is, like dialysis units in every country. Currently, they have to send people who need dialysis either die or have to find the money in some cases for treatment in Australia and New Zealand. And so without understanding that reality on the ground, you don't know how to deliver the sort of human security that's needed in order to create actual regional security, which is what the big players have said they're trying to deliver in this condescending tone. You can't do it from the top down. You have to do it from the bottom up. And to do that, you really need to understand the reality of the people living in the area.
Is that the unique role that India can play?
Yeah, I mean, it lives in similar circumstances. So it's a developing economy. It has you think of it as a big country, but it's made up of many, many, many small villages, and so it has village level economics. It knows how to do small and medium sized industries, even micro industries. It has durable technologies that can withstand very rough climates. It knows how to do it instinctively, and that's why you saw almost a familial kind of atmosphere at that meeting when Prime Minister Modi was there. And that should be something that, if you care about the security of the region, you should value that in a Quad member coming in and being able to deliver something that's much more difficult for Australia or the US to deliver, although Japan has been very good at delivering a lot of on the ground stuff as well. Each of the Quad members brings their own element to the table, and to have one of the Quad members that can deliver at this ground level the sort of things that the people of the region have been asking for is something that just makes security across the region even more resilient and able to provide the conditions for the sort of stability and growth that make it difficult for malign influence to come in and disrupt things.
In terms of China, what sort of relationship does it have with the so-called global South?
So if you take a look at the way that China is interacting in the region, you can see that the focus has been very much elite capture and top down, and it's trying to export a Chinese Communist Party style system, including the security forces and control over major levers of power, including the press and the judiciary, things like that. So it's transformational. And it can look like countries are very acceptant of it. If you look at, for example, the Solomon Islands, but when you actually disaggregate to see how popular it is, you'll see it's really just a very small group that have been captured in this way, but they've been empowered by some of the tools given to them by the CCP to extend control across the country. So it replicates. It does what you see. What happened with Hong Kong is happening in some of these countries in the Pacific Islands, and that's very obviously very disconcerting. And again, really the way to fight that for the people of the region is to empower the bottom up. To empower true democracy, which is of course antithetical to the Chinese Communist Party. So the same things that China is trying to suppress are the things that the people themselves are trying to empower in order to be able to fight back and liberate their countries from what they see as these quite destabilizing external forces.
That was Cleo Paskal of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies speaking with me earlier. Now, the influence of the Global South can be summed up in this graph of share of global GDP, comparing that of the G7, most advanced nations, with the BRICS countries. We can see here that in around 2021, 2022, the two lines crossed over, with BRICS share of GDP rising and the G7's falling. And with the population of the African continent set to explode and overtake Asia over the next 50 to 60 years, we can see the clear trend for the Global South in its continued growth and influence. Marcin, if I can ask you, we left off before talking about China and India. And it's interesting that actually China is part of the Global South. However, the two, would you say that the two have been vying for leadership of the Global South?
Definitely. We can see historically that India, much like China, has sought to be a very influential player across the Global South, including in Africa and Southeast Asia. We can also consider that the bilateral relations between India and China remain very frail. There have been border conflicts in the northeastern and northwestern part of India that led to quite recently to violent clashes. And also considering the internal dynamics in China, it is noteworthy that it is India and the city of Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh that is the seat of the Tibetan government in exile. So there are many points of contention in those bilateral ties, and they are both within the bilateral context as well as you mentioned, efforts of both countries to expand across the Global South.
So how does that complicate either of these countries kind of being representative of the Global South?
I don't think that it is fair to say that at this point either country is a representative of the Global South. I mentioned earlier that the Global South can be understood as a quadricontinental format, and both of these countries are in Asia. So I think that it would be unfair to really put either of these countries in a position of a leader. However, through their regional expansion and integration schemes, they are definitely working towards the position of a leader.
Wen-ti, you know, we had a look just now at the graphs where we can see very clearly, you know, as I said, the power and the influence of the Global South increasing, and this would seem to mean that, yes, in the future, essentially we'll be looking at the power brokers of the world coming from this area that we call the Global South. Has there been any evidence that you've seen so far where they have shown that they can be, you know, influence either regional or international outcomes?
I think that remains a work in process. What we can say, however, is that we are certainly witnessing over time growth of Global South, if not decisive decision-making power, then definitely in terms of degree of influence over international outcomes. And they will also, in the future, come to play a significant role, I think, in terms of shaping the shape of international structure. Like for so long, we're used to the idea of American hegemony or US unipolarity, for example. And nowadays, we're talking about the sense of a proto-bipolarity between US and China. But whether we're going to end up with a bipolarity or perhaps something that's even more looser in terms of distribution of power, something that resembles more like a non-polarity, I think that really depends on how the Global South, especially heavyweight players such as Indonesia, India, and others, which side do they decide to throw their weight around, or whether they decide to find a more disengaged position in terms of international governance. If that happens, though, that may create even more challenges in terms of global collective action problems, especially when it comes to solving global public goods provision issues like climate change and things like that.
Professor Su, we need to touch obviously on Taiwan. Let's start off with what are Taiwan's relations with the so-called Global South?
Yeah, it's very important to notice first that Taiwan has played a very important role in international development assistance to Global South. And there are two sources of such international development assistance, and one is from the government and the other is from the civil society. And for the Global South, the Taiwanese government is a key player, but for the non-Global South, Taiwan civil society is a very strong actor. So for example, Taiwanese people have made tremendous donations to Japan after this earthquakes, disasters, but in contrast, Taiwan civil society has relatively little interest in the Global South. But regarding to the Taiwanese government's Global South policies, there are two kinds. One is for our diplomatic allies, and the other is for the countries with no formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And for our diplomatic allies, the government has provided a great deal of international development assistance and tried very hard to help actually attract investment for these countries. And the main goal is very clear, which is to try very hard to maintain our relationship with them. And for the countries with no formal relations, formal diplomatic relations, the most significant governmental policy is the so-called New Southbound Policy, which is an umbrella initiative that aims to enhance cooperation and exchange between Taiwan and countries in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and in Australia. So far, I think the government has made some achievements, and that's for sure, but there are still a number of future challenges ahead. So for example, the government needs to rethink how to use these new policy tools to advance our national interests in a more effective way. And the other challenge would
and how would you recommend that they do that?
I think what's more important would be that, so for example, for the New Southbound Policy, re-emphasize the importance of sort of military cooperation between Taiwan and countries in Southeast Asia, because there might be, this kind of regional conflicts in this region. So basically, we
that brings
actually
me to my
really,
next question.
Yes, yeah, we need help from them.
Okay,
yeah, right.
Marcin. So we've talked about the so-called global South in terms of wanting to be neutral, non-aligned, especially in relation to the Ukraine war. Now, if Taiwan is in a similar situation, if Taiwan could be the next Ukraine, how might the global South impact Taiwan's future?
Similarly to the case of Ukraine, the countries in the global South will play an important role in shaping the international community's response to a potential contingency in the Taiwan Strait. That includes, for example, voting behavior in UN bodies, but also a possible response towards a diplomatic settlement, or perhaps increasing lethal and non-lethal aid to either side of the conflict. So we have to understand that especially the Indo-Pacific region is becoming increasingly multipolar, and this is why it is important to pay attention to relations that Taiwan is building with those countries. And I believe that the new Southbound policy, which Professor Su mentioned, is an instrumental tool in this.
Tell me about some of those poles in the multipolarity of the Indo-Pacific.
So within the Indo-Pacific, two countries that we should be paying close attention to include India and Indonesia. This is connected not only to the momentum of their economic growth, but also population growth. I believe that with rising population and a rising middle class, those countries will play an increasingly important role in defining regional dynamics within the Indo-Pacific.
Wen-ti, if we talk about kind of like the military connections that Professor mentioned, how do you see any Taiwan contingency playing out? I mean, Marcin mentioned, perhaps supplying arms or not supplying arms. How do you see that scenario?
It's going to be I think it's going to be the kind of situation where Global South will find them torn between wanting to come across as good global citizens, as well maintaining the business and political relation with China, which is an important historical partner for them at the same time. So I guess in more concrete terms, if a conflict did break out between Taiwan and presumably the superpower next door, then Global South may be interested in terms of providing some degree of humanitarian assistance, be it in the form of non-lethal material, be it in the form of providing some kind of temporary refugee resettlement facility and quota. I think that's the kind of stuff we can expect from the Global South. Maybe much more indirectly, should there be non-lethal material that other more proactively helping countries need in order to make their assistance to Taiwan more useful, perhaps Global South may be able to be in a position to provide those raw material as well. The kind of material that would be seen by China as a normal part of doing business rather than outright being adversarial to China.
Hello, I'm Inka Vat of Taiwan Talks. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Feel free to leave us any feedback in the comments section below.